All right, we might get started. You guys hear that okay? So welcome to the next session on resource sharing, again sponsored by the South Australian Government. So thank you to those guys for sponsoring another session. I'm Nathan from the Department of Primary Industries in New South Wales. I'll obviously be chairing this session. We've only got 3 speakers in this session, and we've switched around the second and third one because Kieran's got 2 talks in this session. He's got one over the other side there, so we're giving him enough time to get back over here and give his one as the final one in this one. So I'll pass over to Martin here from British Columbia. He's going to be presenting on behalf of someone else, and he's got a video sort of loaded here, but I'll hand over to him to get his started. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Martin Paish. I'm with the Sport Fishing Institute of British Columbia, and it's my second World Recreational Fisheries Conference. Really happy to be here. Obviously, the first one was in Victoria, which is where I live, Victoria, BC, so that one was easy. This one was a little bit longer flight. But as you pointed out, I'm presenting on behalf of Dr. Jerry Christensen. Jerry was unable to make it here for health reasons, a little bit late in the game. So what we opted to do, rather than me try and paraphrase Jerry's words, we opted to get Jerry to provide a voiceover to his slides. So that's what we're going to do today. You're going to be watching a bit of a video. It is worth hearing Jerry's opinions on this. Jerry is a mentor of mine for many, many years. Him and I sit on the Salmon Allocation Policy Review Board together. So hopefully in the panel session, I should be able to answer any questions. But then again, without further ado, why don't we just get the ball rolling on this? So I'm not sure how I start a video on this thing. So it's not really showing me how to do it here. Click on my name. Whoa, with the mouse. Okay. Okay, I think I got it. Yeah. And then play.
Good afternoon.
There it is.
By way of introduction, I want to apologize for not being present in the room, but also to thank the Australians who are there for the generous scholarship that led to my 1966 doctorate in political science from the Australian National University. As a political scientist, I have titled this presentation, The Politics of Fisheries Resource Sharing, because politics is the human process by which we settle our differences. And there are always lots of differences to settle when it comes to sharing valuable fisheries resources. For anglers, the issues in British Columbia revolve around the question of whether they have access rights and how and where their access lies in relation to Indigenous harvest access. Put simply, do anglers have rights, or is fishing a privilege somehow bestowed by a generous or not generous government? Indigenous rights are not in question. Our First Nations were fishing long before the arrival of Europeans, and that reality is acknowledged in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution and summarized in this brief statement by the Supreme Court of Canada. Subject to the limitations relating to conservation and prevention of harm to others, the Aboriginal people have a priority to fish for food, ceremony, and supplementary sustenance defined in terms of the basic needs that the fishery provided to the people in ancestral times. Non-Aboriginal peoples may use the resources subject to these conditions. But some Indigenous representatives like to argue that while they have rights, as indicated in the previous slide, other Canadians, or settlers as some like to call us, are limited to privileges granted by government. Anglers respond that ordinary Canadians also have access rights, and that these reflect a long and venerable tradition. The tradition goes back at least to Roman times, when fish were viewed as ferae naturae, something that was free for capture by all. This theme was reflected when Magna Carta acknowledged that the Crown didn't own the fish in the sea. And in the early 20th century, Lord Haldane, on behalf of the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council, which then made these decisions, made clear its modern application in a ruling with respect to fisheries in British Columbia. And I quote, "It has been unquestioned law that since Magna Carta, no new exclusive fishery could be created by royal grant in tidal waters, and that no public right of fishing in such waters then existing can be taken away without competent legislation. No such legislation has ever been passed in Canada. Now, government may not own the fish, but it does have regulatory power. Let me quote part of a recent Canadian Supreme Court decision. The legislative authority of Parliament under Section 91 is confined to the regulation and conservation of seacoast and inland fisheries, under which it may require that no person shall fish in public waters without a license from the Department of Marine and Fisheries, but goes on to say Parliament may impose fees for such license and prohibit all fishing without it, and may prohibit particular classes, such as foreigners, unconditionally fishing. As we go on to the next slide, let us reflect briefly on the statement that government may prohibit particular classes, such as foreigners, unconditionally from fishing. It's important to note that Canadians are not included in that definition. Against this background, the challenge is to regulate competing rights. And the courts have said, especially when dealing with Aboriginal commercial rights, quote, the rights of non-Aboriginal Canadians, including regional and economic factors, need to be considered. Good regulation implies a need for transparency and prior consultation. This has not always been the case in Canadian treaty negotiations or other bilateral dealings with First Nations, because public servants are burdened with a serious conflict between their need to honor the Crown's past commitments to First Nations and the current government's constitutional and political obligations to ordinary Canadians. So, what is a fair process for reconciling these fisheries issues? BC anglers are about to enter into an effort to revise the salmon allocation policy that has been in place since 1998. There will be a multi-party working group composed of harvester representatives from all sectors and charged with striving to reach consensus. But will this be a fair process for reconciling disputes? In this case, the direct negotiations between the harvesters are being overseen by a government-to-government committee of First Nations and public servants. This committee gets to review the working group results and can send them back for, quote, issue resolution, unquote, if they don't like what has been decided. They can also file a separate supplementary report if the all-sector part of the process has not given the government-to-government First Nations government process what they want. At this point, it remains to be seen where this will go. If the result is that anglers feel ignored or outflanked, they face a couple of options. They could seek court adjudication as to whether they have rights as distinct from privileges, or they could resort to seeking a partisan political solution in a future election. As my last slide says, stay tuned.
Okay. Thank you very much. Probably one of the most challenging and easy presentations I've ever given. I'm sure that there's lots of discussion to be had about this. I know we have a panel session later on. I don't know how much time we have. I'm happy to try and answer questions. I sit on that Salmon Allocation Policy Review Board with Jerry and am chair of our Sport Fishing Advisory Board's Reconciliation Working Group. So I'm very familiar with how anglers are trying to engage with First Nations fishery resource allocation agreements and stuff like that. So as Jerry said, stay tuned. We haven't got the ball rolling on this one, but it'll be an interesting discussion that we hope to be able to update at future World Recreational Fishery Conferences. Thank you.
So we do have a few minutes now if you want to ask Martin
Doesn't look
Any,
like us.
any further questions or ask any more details, given he does sit on that board with Gerald? So,
Just perhaps give us a little bit
oh,
of
just
background.
if we can just pause for a second and just have the microphone
go.
so we can, people at home can hear. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yep, we're just waiting for the microphone. Sorry.
Thank you. Pap, I just wanted to ask a question about the background to this. I do remember sort of in the news, it's probably a considerable time ago now, but that there was a lot of pressure on that fishery, on the salmon fishery, so that it's not just about the allocation, but it's coming from a context of a fishery that was under pressure because of reported overfishing. Is that correct?
Not entirely. There's no doubt that the salmon fishery in British Columbia is seeing challenges from a variety of different angles. I guess one of the biggest challenges in BC is that salmon are a mixed stock fishery. A lot of it is mixed stocks in open waters, and we're seeing a combination of severely depressed runs along with some abundant stocks. Right, so that's the management challenge that we're trying to deal with. There is another, I would characterize as sort of a political challenge that is associated with the fact that Canada is very heavily involved in the reconciliation process with our Indigenous peoples. We've already gone through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have acknowledged that we need to understand the truth of our history and move forward in a progressive manner with reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And this is where that intersects with allocation. And so this is why it's becoming contentious, is that the sort of current government philosophy is very, very strongly in favor in using harvest resources, a phrase that's out there, as a currency for reconciliation. The challenge that we see in that is most of this activity takes place in small coastal communities and riverine communities where in British Columbia, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people live together and go to school together, go to hockey together, meet each other in the grocery store, and we're all neighbors and friends, right? The fear is that taking resources away from one part of the population and simply giving it to another one as a means of reconciliation isn't going to achieve that overall objective. So I think that's where a lot of the fears lie. Obviously, there's more easily understood fears within anglers that charter guides and tackle shop owners and whatnot are fearful that by the time we reallocate what it currently is sort of a stable at low productivity level resource, that there isn't going to be anything left, right? Probably a long answer to a short question. But
We've still got time, so we can have one more question.
My question you covered in your answer.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for participating. I appreciate it.
Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen, for making it so easy.
Yep.